Okay, I think that we can get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening for another installment of our Process and Practice series. My name is Hannah Katz. I am the Grants and Education Manager here at Dieu Donné. Dieu Donné is the leading cultural nonprofit organization dedicated to serving emerging and established artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand papermaking. Based in Brooklyn, our programming includes residencies, fellowships, and workspace opportunities for artists, workshops and educational programming for all ages, and exhibitions and publications. In this webinar, please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the talk, and we'll come back to all of your questions at the end. You can also turn on closed captions that are automated with the closed captioning button. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce today's guests. Cannupa Hanska Luger is a New Mexico-based multidisciplinary artist creating monumental installations, sculpture, and performance to communicate urgent stories of 21st century indigeneity. Born on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, Luger is an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold and is Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and Lakota. Luger's bold visual storytelling presents new ways of seeing our collective humanity while foregrounding an indigenous worldview. His work has been exhibited at the National Gallery of Art, DC, the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, the Gardner Museum in Toronto, and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Georgia. Luger has been awarded fellowships from Guggenheim, United States Artists, Creative Capital, Smithsonian, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation. Apsara DiQuinzio is the Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the Nevada Museum of Art. Since joining the Nevada Museum of Art in 2021, she initiated and leads the institution's first Green Team, which works to increase sustainability awareness and policy changes within the institution. She recently organized Cannupa Hanska Luger, Speechless, as well as Elisheva Birnov, Reservoirs of Time, currently on view at the museum. Previously, she was the Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art and Phyllis C. Wattis, Matrix Curator at the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, where she organized over 40 exhibitions. She has also held curatorial positions at SF MoMA and the Whitney Museum of American Art. DiQuinzio has contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs and publications, including Artforum, Muse, The Exhibitionist, and Cura. Finally, Tatiana Ginsberg is Director of Artistic Projects and Master Collaborator at Dieu Donné. She studied papermaking and book arts at the University of Iowa Center for the Book and received her MFA from the University of California, Santa Barbara. In between, she spent 2 years in Japan researching naturally dyed papers under a Fulbright grant. Returning to the US, she taught papermaking, printmaking, book arts, and drawing in universities for more than a decade. As Director of Artistic Projects and Master Collaborator at Dieu Donné, she works with other artists to make new work in handmade paper. She also edits the series Papermaker's Tears, Essays on the Art and Craft of Paper for the Legacy Press, which just released a new volume, in case anyone is interested. Her own work combines traditional and contemporary methods of papermaking and is exhibited nationally and internationally. So with that said, welcome Cannupa, Apsara, and Tatiana.
Thank you, Hannah.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening or afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you're joining us from. And it's great to be here with you both today. And I thought we could begin by Tatiana, you telling us a little bit about how Dieu Donné works with artists and about the residency program that Cannupa was part of.
Sure. Dieu Donné is almost 50 years old. So in those many years, a lot of artists have come through and worked with Dieu Donné in different ways, but we are a nonprofit, so we are always trying to bring people in a lot of different formats. And with Cannupa, this is kind of interesting. We haven't really talked about this that much, but you came to us through Garth Green and Gallery, which is your gallery in New York, and we already were working with the gallery with another artist, the wonderful Howardina Pindell, and Garth Green immediately just thought Cannupa's work would make a lot of sense. There would be a really good connection. And then you came in, and we do this generally with artists, and talked a little bit and looked at some things that we had made in the studio with other artists and just kind of brainstormed how we might work together, right?
Yeah,
I don't know if you have
correct.
any memories of the early days.
Yeah, no, it was interesting too because I didn't I'm not that aware of paper and paper making practices until that moment that I came into the studio and put on a pair of rubber boots because we were going into a wet room, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. We're on the 6th floor of this building, and we just hose things onto the floor. I'm into it. And there was so much the build. I mean, the whole facility is designed and built for the practice of paper making, and in every facet that you could imagine there, you have the capacity to do so. But it was well tuned. Everything seemed like it was right in its right space, and I didn't know much about paper or paper making, nor was I really even aware what the residency at Dieu Donné was about, or was like. I don't know. I was under the impression that I was meeting with folks for fabrication, for the making of certain things and working within in the material. And I had worked with like printmaking and 300 weight arches paper and sculpting with that material, just like cutting it and bringing it together. And so that was always what was kind of like stuck in my head. I was limited by my imagination. And then we started making paper, maybe the next time we went there. I feel like it was like the first day I got to watch a sheet being pulled, cooched and the whole process. And I was like, oh, interesting. It's kind of like weaving with hydrogen. I'm into it. Like, this is cool. But yeah, I remember it took a couple of visits before I really understood how and what I was going to be doing at Dieu Donné. And I mean, actually, throughout the residency, we tried a few different versions until we finally came to the image of the piece that you see right in front of you. This is the kind of finalized version. But we started by making individual feathers, and I was thinking about using these feathers. Basically, I just kept thinking that I was going to get like mass production of these feathers sent to my studio, and then I would sculpt with them, not completely understanding that I was there to pull those feathers and make those feathers. I remember like one of the first days being asked if I wanted to try to make paper, and I was like, no. You guys are the experts. Like, what? But don't let me muck it up.
Tatiana, can you go back to that previous slide and describe what's happening there? Because I think for me, one of the interesting things about visiting Dieu Donné and you giving me the walkthrough of the studios was realizing that the way that you work with paper is not the way I was thinking one would work with paper. It's really kind of a sculptural practice. I think I had in my mind originally it would be more like collaging pieces of paper together, but really what you were doing is making the paper itself. And so can you talk a little bit about what that process is and how does one make paper?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's what it's all about at Dieu Donné, is that there is no substrate. You make everything. You don't start with anything that's a given. Everything is a choice. Everything is a decision. Everything is conceptually integrated into what the artist needs it to be. So in the feathers, we thought, well, Cannupa has this vision about making feathers out of paper. And you could take sheets of paper and cut them down and make feathers, but more fun would be to make something in the shape of feathers. And so we made these, it's essentially a decal, the top part of a paper making mold, but it's got the feather shape. It's just really pieces of MDF with feather templates cut into it. and we're pouring pulp. Normally we might be scooping pulp into a mold, but here we're just pouring it. That's Amy Jacobs, my colleague and our senior director. In front, they're pouring black pulp into a set, and there's a set of white ones behind. And then Cannupa is working on another set. So we kind of tried going off of what Cannupa was thinking of, like quantity and how can we make a lot of feathers and different kinds of colors and textures. We tried many sort of different weights. I remember we talked a lot about like how thick they should be, how thin. We talked a lot about what feathers are and how they work, which part of the wing they come from, and all that to get the shapes right. And then what I remember the most is you sort of deciding that they needed to be sort of oversized. So not just the size that maybe even a very large bird might have, but this kind of magical size. And
Yeah.
maybe you want to sort of describe that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I you know, the feather has like a lot of significance to a lot of tribes, you know, across North America, maybe across the Americas, maybe across the world. The application of a feather and the use of feather, even like, you know, common phrases like "put a feather in your hat" as like a badge of honor of some sort or some sort of prowess. This is the application of a feather and how they are revered in a way. And oftentimes within our communities, you have to earn them. You know, they're not, you know, purchased, or, you know, there's significance to them. And so for me, I thought it was really important to, I didn't want to like I didn't want to purchase feathers like goose feathers or anything along those lines and use them. I have before, and I've never really liked the outcome of it, or even like where they come from and what the, you know, the whole industry of having feathers in Hobby Lobbies and all of these sorts of things. It's always like seemed a little anti what a feather was supposed to be, but I also didn't want to present a feather on an object of art that has the same power and value of how they're applied culturally, you know. And so my interest in the development of a paper feather was it gave me agency to use the form without diminishing the substance of the actual piece. So we were kind of exploring how to reproduce a feather, so I could use a feather as a part of the visual language. But then as we were making them, I was like, you know, since we're making them, we could make them huge. You know, we could blow out the scale of it and kind of move towards the mythical or the mystic, you know, in scale. And that seemed to be like the advantage of producing them anyway, over and over. It's like, well, let's make them larger than they actually are, so that they hold significance, but not so large that they're like absurd and you can't imagine it coming from something, you know. So that was the kind of like narrow window to play with, was like, let's make them bigger than anything you would see, but not so big that you lose what it is, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really was a really important conversation or set of sort of ideas that we talked through. And you know, at first we were making these kind of plain ones, like the ones on the screen, and trying to embed something that could function as a quill, or be something that you could tie or use. And then you kind of moved away from that into something that had more color, more what I think of maybe as things that come out of your other practices, painting, etc., of making marks on the feathers. So each one of them becomes not only oversized, but kind of hand decorated, applied, treated, so that each one is kind of this special thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think there was this is also a part of the process of trying to figure out what we're making and how they're going to be applied. I kept thinking with the plain colored, the material that we were using was always really interesting to me. The fact that it was abaca, that it's a material that's a secondary material from banana production, that's one of the things that I loved about it. Plus the quality of the paper itself had this skin-like kind of feel to it. It reminded me of like rawhide or something along those, some sort of organic parchmenty, fleshy kind of feel to it. I liked the aesthetic of that, but I also just liked the notion of where it's coming from and how it's secondary material or something along those lines. And I'm always trying to figure out ways to do that sort of thing, like utilize waste material just in my general practice, like secondary materials, post-industrial materials, some of these kind of things. So it felt really right in that sense. But then as we were exploring shape and form, I started thinking about, if we're going to make these feathers magical, well, then each one can be special, and then I started thinking about it as like, almost like monoprints or monotypes, and just using some of those stenciled, pieces and drawing from the visual language that I was playing with and applying it to the material and having it embedded into itself, like bonded, the hydrogen bond aspect, like the fact that it was a thing, homogeneous, uniform in its structure, felt really nice for this, aspect of it, of working with it in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a really kind of nice moment when things started to come together for this project. So for those of you who are watching, this is he's stenciling with pulp paints that are linen pulp, and the base is abaca generally, and then we also experimented with hemp and some other things as well, but most of the final ones were abaca. And here are some examples.
And the process here is really layering the pulp, right? It's not painting on the pulp. It's adding many different layers of pulp to the process so that it then eventually hardens and it all becomes one piece of paper. Is that correct?
Yeah, well,
yeah, once it's pressed.
Yeah, it's pressed, so it's all one surface. It's funny, the thickness of the material in its wet form, especially like it feels like puff painting. Trying to get control with that, it's like working with a completely different material. Learning how to play with it, how to remove, how to add. All of that stuff was, there was a learning curve to developing that. But yeah, once it runs through the press, it's funny because what we're looking at now is the final pieces of it, and that's a piece of paper. Each feather is a piece of paper, made in that shape, in that form, in that color. But when I would leave the studio, it would be like, half an inch thick of layers of super wet paper pulp, and it gets compressed, and then I come back and I see the results like later. I walk away from them wet, and I remember that first round of these, I was just like, I have no idea what this is going to look like, But through coming back to the residency over and over, like it's in New York. I live in New Mexico, so it was like I traveled across the country to go and hang out for a few days, so I couldn't, come back after it came out of the press immediately. It was like, a couple weeks, a month in between, being able to really kind of interact and see what the results were. But each one of these, this whole process, as we moved through it, it kind of moved us towards what our final pieces were for the thing, because now I'm beginning to understand like what these colors look like, and even in the screens we're looking at, like, so that pink is way more vivid in real life than what we're seeing in this on the screen here. And just understanding that that it's not like a pigment layer. It's like, it's paper, it's paper that's been tinted with the, some of these pigments, of course, but it goes in and actually bonds into a nice flat surface. It's like it's a different quality, it's a different quality than painting with acrylics or even printmaking processes. It felt very tactile, very sculptural. Felt like cake making too. There was like a moment where I felt like I was doing like the icing finishes on baking or something.
I think it's really interesting that it's almost all water too that you're working with. Adding the abaca, but that water is really the substrate here and is something that also is considered sacred. And it makes me think of as a water protector and the phrase water is life, and how that also sort of resonates in this process.
Yeah, it's a wet room for sure. Like I just remember how surprised I was. Well, one, you ride an elevator up to the 6th floor, and I didn't imagine that there was going to be. I didn't know enough about paper making to really kind of understand what it was, and that's the process of pulling a sheet of paper that we're looking at right here, and it's heavy. It's like it's the whole. I got on my giant apron and big rubber boots, and yeah, just kind of moving through the room and understanding a little bit more about that the liquid nature of paper before it becomes this film that you're working with. It's kind of fascinating. But yeah, I mean, water's life. Water's in everything. Yeah.
After making those individual feathers, you moved on to making the bustles, and making larger pieces of paper, which I think is what we're seeing here in this sheet. Do you want to talk a little bit about the bustles and what led you from the feathers, the individual feathers, to the bustles?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things was that I always had this bustle form in my mind because we were developing this work. Once again, just like also being brought to the space through the gallery, through Garth Green and Gallery. The relationship between primarily. So, I think there was an anchor point of making works on paper that make them accessible, kind of wall mounted work, is a component in our interest. And then I kept thinking of them sculpturally. So I was like, I just need parts. I need these parts so I can make other things. But I wasn't allowing myself to imagine what it meant to make something with the paper itself, through that process. So as we were making each of these feathers, this is what I'm saying, there was something iterative that was happening through the process where I started to understand what I was doing there and what was possible. Like I didn't even know what to be able to ask for when I first entered into the room at Dieu Donné. But through the process of working with the material, it opens up all of these other possibilities of like, oh, okay, it's not that the facility is limited. I'm limited. I'm limited in my understanding of what was possible to work with. And so for me, I like making things. So I was really hesitant about even allowing the production of something not happening in my studio. So I kept asking for parts so that I could make these things at home. But then as I began, and it was dumb how long it took for me to realize like, oh, I'm making it here in the studio. Like it's stupid how long it took me to understand that. I remember Amy was like constantly like, we're doing this, it's happening right now. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. We're working. But yeah, it got to the point where I was like, oh, I don't have to make, I don't need 57 feathers to have sent to me so that I can make a series of bustles, we can make the bustle form entirely out of paper. And that was the kind of like mental leap where I was like, I'm still making the work here. I'm just coming here to do it. This is the studio that I'm working in, and I have people who are experts with the material. And so we can, imagine and explore and develop here in this studio. And I swear it took like 3 or 4 sessions before I really could comprehend what this exchange was. And so, the version of the bustle form that we're looking at, this is like a preliminary kind of one of the first sheets that we're going to pull for these bustles. Take 2 of these sheets, we cooch them
or
together.
3, actually.
Yeah. I meant each side, is a
right.
Yeah. There's 2 sections. There's 3 parts to each section, but there's 2 sections to complete a single bustle. And what we're seeing here is just, the production of half of the bustle. You see there's a hot pink layer on the bottom that I was, hoping to get a back glow on the wall as it's hanging. There is a cotton layer in between to create structural rigidity. And then abaca, the hot pink is abaca, and then the surface material would also be abaca. And yeah, that's it's about, almost an inch thick, half an inch, 3/4 of an inch thick before it goes into the press.
Right. So you're really kind of making this layer thing again, just like you did with the individual feathers, but now you're kind of doing this on a bigger scale. And if I remember right, you pulled every single one of those sheets. So that was like a lot of sheets to pull. They're pretty heavy.
Yeah.
So it's very, even though you're saying it took you a while to sort of click in with that idea that you were making it in the studio, once you're kind of got into it, you were all in, you were right there.
Totally. I mean, I think that was, once we started making these big sheets, I could really comprehend the possibility of working with the material, making. It's funny, even now that that we've gone through this process, it opened up my mind to like consider other variations on what is possible with paper. So it's actually opened up an entire now if I ever do it again, I know what I can ask for. Before I didn't even know what I could even ask for or what was possible. So this opened up a whole thing and an understanding of a material that I had worked with before, but didn't understand its process, and that process component of it. I got all in by the time we were doing it. Plus, they were like, there's like when you're layering up these pieces, there's like, how many can we make today before we filled all of the space possible in the room, before they go into the press sheets. And then with the screens too, like how many of these screens do we have? How many tables do we have? I remember us like kind of cannibalizing other tables in the room just so that we can spray these pieces off. And yeah.
Definitely. Right. So for those of you who are watching, each half of a bustle took three layers, and there were two halves to each bustle, and then a big stencil, a mylar stencil, was laid down onto the sheet, and then we removed all the areas that weren't protected by the stencil first with these metal pieces, just kind of roughly. And you can start to see like how much activity there's going on in here, as Cannupa is saying, how many tables we're using and how many people are involved. And then we would use water again, that sort of use of water, the sort of quality of water making the image, as well as being sort of the most essential element. We would use the water pressure to remove all the excess from the edges of the stencil. So blowout is what we call it, blowing out or removing with water pressure. And that got pretty wet and messy. um, pretty much everywhere. And then we would stencil in the center areas on top. So
Yeah,
that
we
was
did
kind
we
of the
did make
process.
one without the stenciling it in by, you know, part of the trying to blow them out completely. But I remember the we needed all of that paper for the structural stability of the piece, and trying to get all of those little parts out in between, and then affecting the kind of overall structure of the bustle. I don't know. These are the process points that are, you know, you don't really dive into when you see the piece mounted on the wall, but like every color that you see, every component, these were all like choices that had to be made. And it didn't happen instantly. You know, it happened through these like successions of, okay, what's the thickness we want? Okay, let's try it with this much, you know, let's try it with that much, you know, all of this back and forth, before we kind of had it all dialed in to get into the mass production, or whatever. We made like, what, 7 of them, mass production. This is a guy who sits in the studio crafting things with his fingertips, obviously. But yeah, the all of the stuff, the equipment, like that piece that's behind me, does that say the crusher?
Yes.
Yeah, all of that stuff was really, you know, it was a cool component to it. But yeah, you know, what we're doing right now is, once again, just like with the smaller feathers, we're applying pigment into these the areas that were, you know, blown out, but we didn't try to blow them out completely. You know, we just wash through it and then go back in with that same hot pink material, paper pulp, to fill in those spaces before it goes into the presses.
So then the
One of my favorite parts was when we were removing that wet material, after each layer has been put in and the stencil has been laid, like just rolling that gloopy paper material with all, like, the hot pink, the white, the black, like all of these different things. I kept feeling like I was making sushi rolls, or I was making jelly rolls. Like there was something, I think this might be why I kept thinking about that as being like baking or icing. It was probably just the color choices that I had in the whole thing, that I was like, oh, this feels like that white, 2 layers of white and the pink, they're like slightly off, you know, so there's like there's something sugary and sweet about it.
So then the final form is actually a really large scale sculpture that almost looks like wings, or people in the galleries, you know, remark about them being butterflies or wings, or and do you want to talk a little bit about the significance of the bustle? I mean, you've said that the bustle is an amplification of communal indigenous knowledge. And do you want to talk about the importance of the bustle, and maybe like in relation to this project and exhibition as well?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, I kept thinking about this bustle as something that I wanted to make, and I kept thinking, this is a good picture to hold there. I like the face that I'm making, for instance, but being able to see this piece come together. This is, you know, we're literally trying to figure out how to create mounting plates for them that are light. I had made some before I came in, brought them all the way from New Mexico, and they were like 40 pounds of, like, you know, wooden bracket. It was like too much. But that form, okay, so a bustle is, you know, it's used contemporarily as a part of powwow dance, which you know, these are fancy dancers wear them, chicken dancers, straight dancers. There's a variety of different dances where this bustle exists on the it's worn on the back, but it, you know, under the previous kind of narrative around, like, you have to earn these feathers, you know, it transmits an idea of your devotion to your community. You know, your community gets to decide how you receive these. So it's not necessarily the community at whole, but like the production of this work, even today, you know, is there are, you know, incredible artisans who make feathered bustles for powwow regalia. And you know, there's always some sort of connection. You know them, or you have a relative who knows them, and they're like, okay, I'm gonna hook you up, and we're gonna make sure that this happens the right way. But this transmits an idea. The bustle worn on the back, it's a symbol of your commitment and your devotion and your sacrifice for your community, you know, in making this. And, you know, powwow dances that exist presently is, you know, these are communal dances. These are social dances, you know, they're a place for gathering, and intertribal social dancing, you know. But some of the forms that they come from are very, very old, and it's a way to like powwow is a way to hide some of our ceremonies that would take place during the 100 years where it was illegal for us to practice our ceremonies and our spirituality. And so you transform some of those practices into social dances and things like that. And there are aspects of customary forms that are hidden in those dances, in those practices, and particularly in the regalia. But the bustle has always had this kind of conical form to it. And when we were working on this project, Speechless, I kept thinking about, I was removing speaker cones from speakers and making big stereos and speaker heads and stacks of speakers, but removing the paper cone from them and producing them out of ceramic. But I kept thinking about these bustles being that paper cone, like it is an amplifier. It communicates an idea, it expresses an idea, and it projects an idea. And just the general form of the bustle, making them out of paper became that's the material it should be made out of in this iteration for this exhibition. Because as you can see, there's a paper cone in the center of the bustle, which is the spreader, which kind of keeps all of the feathers spread apart and presented in the way that we're looking at. We use this paper cone, and these are byproducts of the process of removing them from the other speakers. But I felt like these pieces were going to be the first introduction to the overall exhibition. So when you enter into the exhibition, you walk down this corridor, and on that corridor you see all of these bustles, and you know, the unaware, you know, population kind of thinking of what is this? Is it butterfly wings? Is it wings? You know, they're registering all of that sort of information of what it is, but it's also being reinforced by the speaker cone in the center of it. And it's helping to kind of anchor this visual language as you move into the overall exhibition. And, you know, some of these bustle forms, these are things that I understand the customary application of them. And then if you want to shift to the next slide, please. These, you know, they're applied on some of these kind of future ancestral technology projects that I had been working on as well. But just thinking about how do we, you know, make iteration of this form and move it through as a component to culture, you know, and slipping it through new materials and different stuff like that. We can go to the next one too. Some of these, you know, anchor points, this whole future ancestral technology project is I feel like the Speechless exhibition is somewhere in that scope and timeline of describing customary practices, but moving them through visual language and maintaining that visual language as we move forward.
And you mentioned before that the palette that you chose to work with for the bustles and the feathers, you thought might be related to this new myth body of work as well.
Yeah, I mean, the color palette, honestly, the hot pink that came out of that was really just looking for something to get a back glow when it's hung on the wall. But because I've been, you know, these are previous works, and there's visual language that's entangled in them. The Afghan, you know, as a thing, you know, that I tend to work with, you have no control over what your color choices are going to be. I don't knit these. I find them as complete blankets and then repurpose them. understanding like the care that goes into the development of them. They're all handmade by somebody, you know, somebody who cares about somebody. They're a part of a gift economy, you know, where they're shared and donated. So my work has kind of moved towards that color. But like, I don't know, I'm Northern Plains, and we have a lot of loud, vibrant color in our cultural practices. Like anything that can make it punchy and bright seems right. Yeah, and so as you can see here, this is a photograph of it, but you get a back glow of pink on the wall once they're suspended, and that has a lot to do with that hot pink background. I was really kind of interested in how you can activate the wall with the sculpture rather than frame it or turn it into something completely two-dimensional. It's like, how do you activate the space that it's actually hanging in so that it bleeds beyond the border of what it is, you know? And I think that information came from as we're doing the blowouts and we're watching these fibers spread off the edge of the paper. It's a completely different quality than if I were to laser cut these things out of sheets of paper. You know, seeing that organic bleed and that shed made me kind of understand that molecular shift, that dissolve from something rigid, something that we understand, into the environment that it inhabits. And so even using color to do that same thing, using light, reflected light, to help with that kind of like bleed and transformation, that this isn't an object in space, but instead it activates the space that it inhabits. These are some of the choices that took place with these colors.
And then after you made the paper component, you finished them at the Nevada Museum of Art during the installation. So you added these other elements like the synthetic hair to them. Do you want to talk about the hair a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we prototyped these pieces at Dieu Donné, but didn't have the time with my schedule to build them there. We were under the understanding there were all these kind of cross wires, and so it finalized that it all ended up at Nevada before everything was complete, and it was nice to be able to come out there. There are the synthetic hair that's hanging in it, but just in the general exhibition, I was using hair as an anchor point for power, and to give it power. There's braids that run throughout all of those speakers that daisy chain everything together. And so I thought it would be important to apply that to these works. But it's also there's if we go back into process and practice, like there's something real practical about the application of that hair, which is the mounts in which we created to hold these two pieces together and suspend them from the wall. The safest, kind of longest lasting way to apply them was with rivets, where there's a little bit of play in the paper because it's going to absorb moisture and release moisture and do all sorts of things. So if it were glued, it would cockle and do weird things. So we have these mechanical connections for it, and it's these rivets. These rivets, it's a completely different aesthetic sitting on the surface of that paper we made. So twisting up a bit of hair and plugging the rivet hole with it made the rivet have purpose, and it kind of like softens the whole thing and then brings everything together. I liked the hair. I thought it was a nice kind of like touch to finish the work off.
Yeah, and then it leads you into the other work as well. Maybe we can forward the slides to show some more images of the bustles and then leading into the other body of work. So there you see the daisy chained braided hair there, which
yeah.
was just mentioning. And there were two different styles of bustles that you made here. You see these larger ones as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And then do you want to talk about the radio tower and the process of adding the feathers to the radio tower?
Yeah, that one beam that we're seeing there, that's a part of the radio tower, was actually sacrificed at the museum for the expansion of the museum. And so I asked for us to use that, one of those branches or one of those trees, for this installation back into the space. And it's a, you know, it's a radio tower and transmitter, but I thought that one was so significant because it's from the place that I, you know, gave it the pole of honor, you know. And you can see those original feathers, all of those tests that we were doing with, like, okay, what do these quills work, you know, how are they going to work? Once we started putting all of this piece together, I immediately recognized that there was a potential to create a coup stick with this one piece, and hang these feathers from its interior.
And I'll just add to that story that when the arborist was harvesting this tree, as a result of our expansion, we had to remove it. He accidentally cut off the tip of the log. And I called Cannupa and said, oh, he accidentally cut the log. What should we do? And he said, just keep all the components and we'll work with it. And then you had this really incredible way of dealing with this chance situation that happened on the site by creating this beautiful bandage and bandaging those two pieces back together with the hot pink rope.
Yeah, building that whole tower was nuts. So we're sitting out in front of the building with a, you know, electric chainsaw and some assistance. Everything went smooth. It's funny. You know, I think this is the conversation around the process. I'm not working alone. You know, all of us have been kind of working together towards this project, and even the mistakes we make become potential possibilities. You know, it's like, don't limit yourself by your expectations. You know, adapt, adjust. Something beautiful can come out of it.
Well, I think something beautiful did come out of it, which is this show, which looks incredible. And it's also really interesting to see the speaker cone many times, right, in these different forms, that the literal speaker cones that you harvested in the bustle pieces, and then all of these ceramic ones that you made. And that you're using, you know, repeatedly. And I don't know if you want to expand on that form a little bit, but
yeah, I'll say that I've never sat on a wheel and thrown clay until I was doing this process, and got really good at throwing speaker cones. Like, you know, I don't know what my bowl or mug making wheel practice is, but I got good at throwing speaker cones. It's such a weird thing to get into, but it was fun. It was just something mesmerizing and methodical about that level of and scale of production. And then there's like sculptural components. There's all of these anchors. This whole exhibition is called Speechless, and we kind of reiterate this visual language that I applied to it, which is teeth biting its tongue, you know. So it has this conversation around how we how you're silenced, how we silence ourselves, what it means to bite your tongue, how long do you do that, and can you still communicate without making sound, you know. And I feel like this whole exhibition kind of like amplified this idea of communication without making noise. So even if you're silenced, how do you keep the story alive, keep telling the story?
So I'm going to interject. Thank you, all three of you, so much. This is really fascinating. I think we can probably cycle through the images of the finished work, but I want to encourage folks to enter questions rather, and we will answer them into the Q&A box that'll be at the bottom of your screen. And we have a couple great questions already. One is, if papermaking led you to learn more about native traditions of papermaking?
No, I don't know anything about papermaking in any way, shape, or form. There is an iteration of it that I was kind of familiar with, which is tapa cloths from my wife's from Maui. and has Hawaiian ancestry, and was, explored tapa and tapa making, tapa cloth making. And there I was like, oh, that's pretty much a paper form of production. But nothing from where I'm from. I've never come across paper production in the Northern Plains, or at least not from Mandan Hidatsa or Rikara or Lakota practices.
Thanks. There's a question about weight, about the feathers, how heavy they were after they were dried, but maybe you can speak about weight of all the pieces and like how the material transformed.
Yeah, it's heavyweight paper. It's not clay or steel, so my point of reference is all screwy. I think paper's light, I'm like, oh, this is nice. Like, it's not going to break my back to move. It gave me a lot of, area to cover and volume to cover on the walls without compromising, because of weight. Scale could be reached, where working with other materials, ceramic and steel and wood and some of these other materials that I tend to work with, they get real heavy. Even the felt that I work with gets really heavy, but the paper, once all of the water is removed, even if the thickness and isn't weight a measurement of like paper structure?
Sure, yeah. Grams per square meter and all of that.
Is that what it is? Yeah, maybe Tatiana, do you know what the weight of this paper would be actually, like in that grams per square meter narrative?
I would say, I mean, we didn't weigh it, that wasn't kind of our focus, but it's heavy for paper, but it's light for anything else. So sort of like thick watercolor paper kind of quality, thicker than normally thick watercolor paper, maybe.
Yeah, totally.
We have another question. As a sculptor, what is your preferred medium to work with, and how did your understanding of various media change while working on this installation? And a related question about how working through this process, if you're going to incorporate in the future.
I like material, so I don't have preference. I like process. I like learning. I mean, every time you work with a new material, you actually expand your capacity to create out of other things, and that always seems more valuable to me. I work with clay a lot. I don't know if it's preferable. I'm like, I don't know, whatever. I was ADHD before it became an internet sensation. I jump around, and need kind of a lot of information to maintain focus. And I'll get exhausted with something if I'm working with just one material. So like one material actually informs the next, and so working with the paper, I was drawing from my clay knowledge and my textile knowledge to work with the paper, and now the paper is going to open up a whole nother spectrum of possibility of working with other material. So I was kind of excited about. I'm always excited about learning new things, because it does open up channels to imagining different ways, but it also reinforces some of your knowledge around previous practices, what's possible. So I like that. And what was the second part of that question?
If you plan to incorporate paper making into future projects.
Yeah, like I had said to Tatiana, like, we've gone through this process, but now I know what to ask for. So that changes your interest, right? Like, once you kind of like open up the possibility, it's hard to shake it. Can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Totally. So there's a comment I'll share that the ecological sustainability of the medium also adds something to the conversation and dialogue. Not a question, just a comment. And then there's another one. I'm intrigued by the tradition that feathers and other materials motifs in your work would have been bestowed as an honor or gift. and can't help but think of this project as you creating your own honor or gifts that you're sharing with the viewers. Did this process bring any surprises or revelations that will guide your future work?
Yeah, I think yeah is the probably easiest component to that. I think what's always challenging for me as you know, an Indigenous person working within larger institutions and actually gaining access to points of expression on, you know, larger arenas of arts. I want to share our stories and our knowledge, but I don't want to diminish them or turn them into anecdotes in the process. You know, I don't want to cheapen what our customary practices are by oversaturating the information or being a bottleneck to what that information is. And so this is, you know, none of these are actually feathers. You know, none of these actually have that honorific application. They are, at the end of the day, another material kind of expressing a visual language and a motif. And I don't dive into it deeply in the exhibition space. Like here we are talking about it. But I like leaving things open to interpretation, and I like having these visual languages embedded in institutional spaces for Indigenous people to enter into and actually be the wiser in the room. You know, I think that there's something challenging about operating within a society that has these kind of like social structures around race and identity and the politics that it's embedded in there. And oftentimes from a space of margin, when you're invited into these spaces, you're in, you know, it's like it's a privilege that you got to come here. And I'm not into that. You know, that was one of the conversations that we actually had as we were installing this show. I was like, it's as if the museum was built around some of these stories that had been on the land long before the state was a state, you know, long before Reno was born, you know, any of these sorts of things. So like playing with that language is always kind of interesting to me, and I want to keep like Easter eggs for some of my like tribal communities when they enter into these spaces, so that they're the most knowledgeable in the room, you know, when they enter into it, or at least they see these kind of like subtle hints and ties, and I'm not necessarily pushing that forward in the exhibition's statement or anything along those lines.
Absolutely. So we are at 7:30, but there is one great question. If there was any sound in the exhibition room.
That's a good question. The intention was no sound, was silence. But because you're creating silence in an exhibition, you get bleed from, you know, sound bleed from other spaces. And I was like, oh, I can just tolerate that. But then we started thinking about it. It was like, oh no, actually, I think you need to make the sound of silence. And so we started kind of thinking about what that sounded like. Like you can suspend disbelief when you're hearing sound bleed coming from another room, you know, that is not supposed to be in here. But if you put a sound in the room, we chose a sort of white noise, but it's actually the sound of wind blowing on a mountain or something like that. I was like, that's the sound of silence, you know. And if we play that in the room and there's a sonic quality that's happening in that space, then any other sound bleed or anything like that, you're at least anchored into the silence.
Okay, so that was a great one to end on. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I do want to mention that there's a book coming out. Apsara, do you want to chat about the book quickly?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there's another Easter egg in the exhibition, and that is a book that is a really wonderful, unique collaboration between Dieu Donné and the Garth Greenan Gallery and the Nevada Museum of Art, and it was designed by Small Editions, working closely with Cannupa in New York. And so that we're expecting that beautifully designed catalog to come out in February, I believe. So stay tuned and look out for it.
Absolutely. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We so appreciate it, and we hope that you enjoyed it. And of course, I want to thank Apsara, Cannupa, and Tatiana for all of their insights and sharing this incredible project with us. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.